It was pouring rain when Jake made his way down the dark, rural highway. He had just finished a long shift at the factory and was desperate to get home. The wind howled as he drove, his headlights cutting through the thick rain. It had been a miserable evening, and he wished he had stayed home. Suddenly, as he rounded a bend, he saw a figure in the rain standing at the side of the road, thumb outstretched. The figure was a man, drenched and wearing a worn-out jacket. Jake hesitated for a moment. He wasn't one to pick up hitchhikers, but something about the man's desperate stance made him feel guilty. He stopped the car, rolling down the passenger window just enough to hear him. The man explained he had been stranded for hours, waiting for help. He seemed harmless enough, so Jake reluctantly unlocked the door and motioned for him to get in. The man climbed in, dripping wet, and muttered a quick thanks before settling into the seat. As they drove, Jake made small talk, but the man remained eerily quiet, his eyes fixed ahead. Something felt wrong. Every so often, Jake would glance over at him, only to find the man staring intently at him, his eyes wide and unblinking. The rain continued to pour harder, and Jake's unease grew. He didn't want to be rude, but wished he could just get to a populated area. After a few tense minutes, he turned to ask the man if he had a destination in mind. But when he looked over, the passenger seat was empty. The man was gone. Jake slammed on the brakes and stopped the car, his heart pounding in his chest. He was alone, soaking wet in the rain with no trace of the hitchhiker. He searched the area for a few minutes, but there was no sign of anyone, no footprints in the mud, no shelter where the man could have gone. Shaken, he continued home, unable to explain the inexplicable encounter. That night, while lying in bed, he heard faint knocks at his window, but when he got up to check, there was nothing. It was a dreary, cold afternoon, and Sarah was walking home from work, tired from the day's events. The rain had started falling heavily, so she pulled her coat tighter around her, her footsteps echoing on the nearly empty street. She preferred walking in the rain. Something about the calmness of the wet world brought her peace. But that day, the usual comfort was replaced by a creeping sense of unease. As she walked down the long, deserted street, she noticed something strange. Up ahead, in the dim light of the street lamp, there was a figure standing under the awning of an old store, looking in her direction. She thought little of it, assuming it was just someone trying to stay dry. But as she drew closer, something felt off. The figure stood still, unmoving, just watching her. When Sarah was about 5 feet away, the figure abruptly stepped into the rain, walking directly toward her. That's when she realized it was not a person at all. The figure's face was pale, almost unnaturally white, and its eyes seemed black as the night. She quickened her pace, heart racing. As she turned to glance back, the figure was no longer in sight. Her nerves on edge, she continued walking, trying to shake off the strange encounter. But as she neared her apartment building, she saw it again, standing at the corner of the street, watching her. This time, it didn't step forward. It just stood there, unmoving. Sarah ran the last few feet to her door, locking it behind her. That night, she heard tapping on the windows, though she was certain no one was outside. The next morning, the street was completely empty, no figure, no rain-soaked footsteps leading to her apartment. Rachel had always walked past the old, abandoned house on her way home from the grocery store. It had been empty for years, its windows boarded up, the garden overgrown. She never paid it much attention, figuring it was just another decaying building. But that night, as she trudged through the rain, something was different. The house stood in complete darkness, save for one light, a flickering light from a single window on the second floor. It seemed out of place. Intrigued and a little unnerved, Rachel walked closer, her boots splashing through the puddles. The light flickered again and then went out, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. She had just passed the house when she heard something. A sound, soft at first, then louder. It was the sound of footsteps following her, echoing in the rain. Startled, she turned around, but there was no one in sight. She quickened her pace, but the sound continued. Step by step, it matched her movements. Her heart raced as she glanced over her shoulder again. Then, in the dim light of a street lamp, she saw it. A shadow, moving swiftly toward her from the direction of the old house. Rachel froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness, and seemed to be following her. She sprinted the rest of the way home, reaching her apartment building with the shadow still close behind. When she entered her apartment and locked the door, she felt a chill wash over her. There on the windowsill was a small, damp footprint, and in the reflection, standing just outside, was a figure still watching her. The rain had been falling for hours, turning the streets into rivers of glistening black pavement. Jason pulled his hood tighter over his head and adjusted his backpack. It was late, nearly midnight, but he had no choice. The last bus had already left, and his only option was to walk the 3 miles home. At first, the rain didn't bother him. The rhythmic patter against his hood was oddly calming, and the empty streets felt peaceful. The only sounds were the occasional distant honk of a car and the squelch of his sneakers against the wet pavement. But after a while, something shifted. As he turned onto a dimly lit side street, he heard its footsteps. Not his own. Jason paused for a moment, straining to listen. The rain made it hard to tell where the sound was coming from. He turned around, expecting to see someone walking behind him. The street was empty. A single flickering street lamp cast an eerie glow, but there was no sign of another person. Shaking it off as paranoia, he continued walking. Then there it was again. Tap, tap, tap. Someone was behind him. He was sure of it now. The sound was distinct, just a few paces back, perfectly in sync with his steps. He sped up, his heart pounding, and the footsteps matched his pace. His breath hitched. Was someone following him? Forcing himself not to panic, he stole a quick glance over his shoulder. Nothing. The street was still empty, but the footsteps hadn't stopped. Jason took a sharp turn into an alleyway, hoping to shake off whatever, or whoever was behind him. He pressed himself against the brick wall, holding his breath. The rain dripped from the fire escapes above, the cold water trickling down his neck. Silence. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then, just as he was about to step back onto the main road, he heard it again. The footsteps. But they weren't behind him anymore. They were in front of him. A dark figure stood at the other end of the alley, motionless. Jason's stomach dropped. The figure was tall, shrouded in a long coat, its face obscured by the shadows. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there. Jason's breath came in short gasps. He turned on his heel and sprinted back the way he came. He didn't look back, he couldn't. He just ran, his feet pounding against the wet pavement. The streets blurred past him, the rain stinging his skin. When he reached his apartment building, he fumbled with the keys, hands shaking as he forced the door open. He slammed it shut behind him, twisting the lock. His chest heaved. He leaned against the door, listening. The only sound was the heavy downpour outside. And then, just as he exhaled in relief, he saw a wet footprint on the floor.